Thank, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a really nice event or conference to be a part of. Yeah, and I hope I've everything is clear. If you have a burning question during the talk, feel free as well. But yeah, we'll definitely have some time for questions after. So I was asked to start by talking about a little bit about my career path before I actually get to the sciencey bit of my talk. So I've laid out a timeline here which covers nearly 2 decades of my life, which is probably the entirety of most of your lives. But I thought I would just start by zooming in on some of the more major milestones for my career and basically just share with you some observations of what I found kind of important over the years. And so these are some of the events that I thought might be worth pointing out. And basically, I started in 2008 my bachelor's degree in psychology and statistics at the University of Delaware in the US. Then I did an RA job in Boston, Massachusetts, in the Visual Attention Lab. I started a MSc in neuroscience in Frankfurt in Germany in 2014. In 2016, I started my PhD in Oxford in the Brain and Cognition Lab, was run by Keynote. And then 2020, I did a postdoc and received a fellowship for some research in Oxford. And then I started my own lab, so the Dynamic Cognition Lab in 2024. And I guess maybe one of the first and obvious things that I realized when I was kind of collecting some thoughts was that this career has given me the opportunity to travel and live in different parts of the world, which is not something I necessarily planned for from the start, but it's definitely been one of the biggest unexpected benefits from the path. And if you're considering a life in research or academia, I think it's definitely one of the bonuses, more so than the pay, I would say. Uh, so I thought maybe I might zoom in here on the more relevant time for you all, which is this early quote unquote part of my career. And that's everything pre-PhD. And I just wanted to highlight for you the things that I feel like I took away from each of these phases, and give you maybe a tip for each phase, so to say. So I started out as an undergrad studying psychology and statistics in the US. And I there having two majors is pretty common, but my choice wasn't particularly strategic. I didn't really actually realize that psychology and statistics even fit together until an embarrassingly late moment. And I mostly chose them because they were taught by my favorite teachers in high school, who were Mr. Bruno and Mrs. Cox, yeah, that's that kind of influenced my decision space. I didn't get particularly high marks or do especially well at university. So for a long time, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And that only really started to change when I did my first research internship. And even that happened quite randomly. So the only class in psychology where I was doing pretty well was statistics, and that was because it was my other major. So I went to my stats professor and I asked if I could work in his lab. And I had absolutely no idea what he actually did for research. And it turned out he worked in a cognitive psychology lab studying things like memory and attention. And I enjoyed it so much so that I still am doing that. So I was not at all at this phase a life planner or like very strategic. Um, so I don't know if I have actually good tips for this, but my major takeaway is kind of just lean into what you're enjoying doing and what you're good at doing. And sometimes I think it's easy to overthink the strategy side of things when you're making decisions. And sometimes those decisions are better guided by just what makes you happy or what feels kind of engaging as you're doing it. After my studies, I took the only job that I was offered, which was an RA job, and I moved to a new city where I didn't know anybody, and it's relatively far away from my hometown. Um, the lab was quite unusual, so there were no PhD students. It was postdocs and the PI. So I was, maybe 10 years, at least 10 years younger than everyone else. And I was significantly more clueless than everyone else. I really didn't have any idea what I was doing. But I found my RA years amazing. So it gave me the space to figure out what the job actually looked like for the long term. I learned more about that in my RA time than I ever did in the degrees I took. Um, I learned about the field and I got to work with some incredible colleagues. And the thing I kind of the tip during this period was the absolute privilege it is to be the dumbest person in the room. So I was constantly in a privileged position to learn from the people around me. And so sometimes this can feel intimidating, but honestly it is a good space to be in if you're having that feeling. Um, at the end of my RA job, I started applying to PhD programs with pretty much only one goal, which was I wanted to travel. I applied across Canada, Europe, and Australia, and this time I actually got into these programs, which was a contrast from my earlier application phase. Then I had a different problem. So Canada meant I would be committing to about 6 years in one place, whereas the Europe and Australian programs were about 3 year programs, and then I would have to kind of find a real job, and that also didn't sound so good. So I ended up looking for something in between, which was I found a master's program in Germany. Um, One of the big benefits there was German education is free. So that was novel and good. And it was a good middle ground, just kind of gave me a chance to explore something and get more confident in the work. So the master's was great. I got to do a lot of different research experiences. It gave me time to slow down and figure out what I actually wanted to do. And it helped me realize that there's really no rush in getting to that PhD. And so I finally did start my PhD in 2016, and then I was 26 at the time, so it had taken me a while to actually get there. But that felt like an advantage. So by then I already knew what I wanted to do and I enjoyed doing it. And I ended up in a very big lab. I met lots of people, and both scientifically and personally, I just had a lot of fun. So for a lot of people, a PhD is extremely stressful, which of course makes sense. But it did feel different. I think maybe part of this was that I had taken a bit more time to actually get there, and I felt more confident in what I was doing and why I was doing it. So, yeah, the last tip is maybe obvious, but just enjoy what you're doing. If you're not, maybe change, do something different. But yeah, uh, so these are, of course, just my experiences. They're not actually meant as a script or a playbook or anything, but just reflections on my own kind of path. And these kind of tips work for me, and they continue to try to apply them whenever I can. So hopefully they're somewhat useful. Um, Maybe obvious, I don't know. Okay. All right, I'm going to seamlessly now transition into the science part of my talk. So one of the things we're interested in my lab is memory. And that's because our behavior is driven by our ability to encode, maintain, and retrieve information from short-term memory. And this short-term store is something we call working memory. And these processes don't take place in isolation, but they're instead shaped by the dynamics of the world around us, as well as our own actions and our own choices. So, not just the features of the apple, but also what we want to do with the apple. All right, so today I'm going to focus on three projects, and each of these targets a different stage of working memory. And my goal here is to understand working memory through a lens that recognizes that it is itself inherently action focused. So it's not just about encoding information or visual features, but also the actions and behaviors that are associated with them. And we'll start by thinking about this encoding phase. Um, and for each of my sections, I'm going to start with kind of a spoiler. So sorry for the lack of dramatics here, but for this first project, I hope I can convince you that action plans are encoded early into working memory, despite intervening response demands. So let me tell you what I mean by that. This work builds on a lot of other research, and that research suggests a sort of automatic and privileged state of action information during working memory maintenance and recall. So, in other words, past work has shown that when we maintain information in mind and when we retrieve it, actions that are associated with that information often come along for free, so to say. So you kind of you get those actions in memory for free. Um, but the focus of this study was to try and understand how they actually get into memory and when they actually come into memory. So when do we encode action plans into our working memory? And here, and actually across all of the experiments, I'm going to show you we use EEG and time frequency analysis. And I'm going to take a short moment to pause and tell you about the signals that we're looking at here. Some of these might kind of seem very complex and convoluted. I'm going to try to walk you through how we actually derive the signals, but it's also perfectly fine to just think about what they're representing, which I'm going to talk about as well. So if you don't totally wrap your head around how we get to those signals, I'll just tell you what they stand for, and hopefully that still makes sense. So when you're recording EEG data, this is what the data looks like when it's coming in. So on the left side, you see these kind of funny names, which are the names for the different electrodes that are placed on the scalp. On the x-axis, time is passing by, and each of these squiggly lines represents a change in voltage across time. So mostly this probably looks like just random squiggly lines. But occasionally, what you're going to see is periods of rhythmicity. So I'm going to zoom into one of these short segments. So this is just over a second long, what I've zoomed into from the recording. And if you, what you see is there's this pattern here where the signal seems to go up and down and up and down. And if you simply just counted how many times the signal goes up and down within a second, you'll see in this case, it cycles about 10 times per second. And this is how we can classify the frequency of a signal. So the frequency is classified by how many times it goes up and down within a second. And each of the different frequency bands have names. 10 times per second is something that we call alpha. And you'll hear me talk about alpha as we go on. And beyond frequency, you can also measure the size of those changes. So how big the signal changes, what's the difference between the peak and the trough of this signal. And this is called the amplitude or the power. And this tells us how much alpha activity is present at any given time during the signal. And basically through a bit of magic math, we can transform this raw signal, so this raw kind of time series, into associated amplitudes or power for different frequencies across time. And that's what time frequency analysis is. So you basically, at each time point, I get a measure of how much each frequency is in the signal. So this is kind of a cartoon example, but you can see, blue would mean there's low power, orange would mean there's high power, and you can look at this as a function of the different frequencies. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on the analysis. Oh, and of course, there's not just alpha in the brain. There's a whole bunch of other associated frequencies. And each of them is something we know a little bit about. And so when I said earlier, if none of that made sense, here's the kind of big takeaway. So today I'm going to concentrate on two frequency bands in particular. And those are the alpha band and the beta band. And very roughly, you can just think about these as representing selection of motor information and visual information. So I have now, through these two kind of measures, a marker of both motor selection in the brain and visual selection in the brain. All right. So in all of the experiments I'm going to show you, we use a variant on the same basic working memory task. And I'm going to just take a moment to walk you through it in detail. But at a very high level, participants are going to be required to report the tilt of a colored bar that they had previously seen. So this is what the structure of the first experiment looks like. Here, the trial starts with what we call a pre-cue, and this indicates which of the two bars they're going to see next are relevant. Then there's a short delay. Encoding happens, so here two bars appear, and one of the bars match the color of the cue they saw previously, and this is the bar that participants should remember. Then there's a delay, and this is a very long delay, which I'm going to explain why it was so long in a bit. And then we reach the probe, which signals to participants that they can begin reporting the item from memory whenever they're ready. Once participants start responding, they enter the response dial phase, and here their goal is to align the dial with the remembered orientation. And so importantly, we use the manipulation here that directly links the memory content to the response itself. So specifically, the tilt of the item is linked to a particular hand. So if participants wanted to respond to items tilted to the left, like this bar here, they can press the left response key. So they can press the left response key to make the dial move to the left. And participants stopped responding when they felt like the dial matched the remembered orientation. So the dial cannot move past the horizontal position, which means that leftward tilted items can only be reported with the left hand, and rightward tilted items can only be reported using the right hand. And the item's tilt was orthogonal to its position at encoding, meaning that leftward tilted items could appear equally probably on the right or on the left. Good. Okay. So because of this manipulation, we can track in mind the associated motor plans via the brain waves I was telling you about before. So basically, we know when we're planning to use a particular hand, we would see a relative decrease in beta power contralateral to the in contralateral versus ipsilateral electrodes over motor cortex. So basically, the amplitude in the beta waves goes down on the opposite side of the head compared to which hand you want to use. And this is our main dependent variable, and I'll call that sometimes beta lateralization. And we're going to use this as a proxy for motor selection. All right, yeah, that's the main takeaway for the dependent variable. And then finally, in the task, participants got some feedback on the report. All right, the last important manipulation I want to tell you about is what's happening during this delay period. And here, participants are asked to complete a secondary motor task. So they press either the left or the right key, depending on the location of a square. And the task is not relevant at all to the memory task, but it was present on every trial. So crucially, this meant that participants knew in advance that they would need to make a non-memory guided response after encoding, but before reporting. So let's look at results. So here we're looking at the entire encoding period, starting with the onset of the items, and we're looking at this relative to the eventual hand that participants will be using. And what I'll be plotting will be the percentage of power in the contralateral electrode relative to the ipsilateral electrode. On the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have frequency. So remember, beta is about 13 to 30 hertz. So if we see evidence that the brain is preparing or selecting a particular hand, then we're going to see a big blue blob that runs between 13 and 30 on the on this first plot here. And then what we're also going to see on the bottom plot is just that frequency range averaged, so that we see just a single line for that entire frequency range. Okay, let's see what that looks like. So just to demonstrate what this looks like, we can see that the period leading up to the actual response, we get this clear beta suppression that ramps up over time. So as we get closer to the response, people are showing more and more beta selection. And this is not particularly surprising because we know they're about to press the button. Like they're just about to press the button. This is what the brain does when you're about to press the button. But More interestingly, is we also see evidence of this early encoding of eventual response hand. So that's in this period, nearly 6 seconds before they're going to press any button associated with the memory, we get the exact same sort of profile of beta selection. And this despite the fact that participants know with certainty that they're going to first need to perform a completely different task. So we took this as evidence that participants encode actions into memory alongside the visual content. So when we look at encoding phase, we see evidence for early encoding of prospective actions, and this shows us the visual memory can be action-oriented from its very earliest moments. Next, we're going to turn to the maintenance phase, and this was a project led by a former PhD student in the lab, Daniela Greisch. And for this project, I want to show you both visual and motor information is immediately recovered after interference during working memory maintenance. So a key insight about working memory in the real world is that we need to protect our memories during the maintenance phase. And we need to protect them from interference from visual distraction or interrupting tasks. So it's not just important to encode information in memory in the real world, you need to protect it while you continue doing whatever it is that you are doing. And past work has shown that working memory representations can be subject to costs. Although on the whole, working memory is pretty robust. And within our own lab, we've shown that information in mind can be shielded or protected from external information or external interference on the basis of environmental regularities. But much of the past work has focused on mitigating or lowering the costs of interference before the actual interfering event occurs. Our interest in this project is slightly different. So here, what we wanted to look at is how do you recover your memories after something interrupted them. So that's our main research question here. How do we recover internal representations after interference occurs? So to answer this, we're going to use, again, EEG and a very similar task design for this study. I'm going to highlight a few of the elements from this design. So here, there was no pre-cue. Participants initially coded 2 items into working memory. This is followed by a delay and what we call a retro cue. And this reliably indicates which item participants will need to report at the end of the trial. So here, the orange cue means participants are going to have to report the tilt of the orange bar. After the retro cue, an interrupting task occurs. So participants had to respond to the tilt of the lines. Then participants see a probe and they report the remembered tilt. So using this design, there are 2 main questions we want to address regarding the memory recovery. First, we're going to ask what information within a memory is actually recovered. So I just told you that actions are immediately encoded into working memory, and this might mean that it's unnecessary to reactivate visually linked information following interference. So if I know what I have to do at the end of the trial, why do I need to remember all the visual details of that information? I can just act on the motor representation. So in order to ask about what information is recovered, we're going to use the same trick as the previous experiment, where the memory content is directly linked to the response hand. And specifically here, tilt corresponds to the response hand. And we've already seen that we can use this to measure beta lateralization as a proxy for response selection. But since the visual and motor information are orthogonal, we can also use this to independently track visual selection of information via lateralized alpha. So this is a measure we're using that is well established, which basically shows that when you're trying to remember an item that was, for example, on the left, we see relatively less alpha power on the right side of the brain over the visual areas. So this is analogous to the beta measure for motor, but focused on a different part of the brain and concentrating on a different frequency band. So through these oscillatory signals, our plan is to track what information is recovered following interference. The next question we will address is when participants reactivate memory content following interference. And here we consider two possibilities. The first scenario, we considered participants might activate memory content just in time. So that is, the memory content is always reactivated just before the expected time of the probe, irrespective of when the interference actually occurs in the delay. The other scenario is called the immediate reactivation scenario, and in this case, we would expect the reactivation of memories to occur immediately following the interfering event. So in this case, the reactivation of memory will be temporally dependent on the interference that occurs. So in order to kind of differentiate between these possible scenarios, we included 3 time points of interference within the delay. Okay, so we have 4 possible outcomes in our or 4 possible hypotheses in our experiment here. So we can consider what information is reselected following interference, and that might be only motor, or it might be both visual and motor information. And we propose 2 possible time points for this reselection. You might get just-in-time reactivation, and that would occur just before the probe. Or you might see immediate reactivation, which was time locked to the interference itself. And here I'm going to be plotting visual and motor selection signals across the trial for each of the possible scenarios. And I'm just going to plot the time course here for simplicity. All right, let's start with reactivation of only motor content just before the probe. So this is all hypothetical possible scenarios, not real data, just showing you here what might happen. So in a motor alone, just-in-time reactivation scenario, immediately following the retro cue, we expect to see this initial selection of the visual and motor signals. And this is because the interference has yet to occur. Nothing actually interrupted people. They just kind of initially select the memory information for both the visual and the motor. Important, following this initial selection, in this scenario where only the motor signal is reactivated just in time, we would see that this happens just before the probe, only for the orange line. If both sensory and motor information are reselected in a just-in-time manner, we would expect results to look like this. So we see a dip in both the blue and the orange line. In the scenario where only motor information is reactivated immediately, we should see this graded reactivation that depends on the time of the interference. And finally, in the last scenario, we would expect to see reactivation that's temporally dependent on the interference for both visual and motor information. Okay, let's look at some results. So we'll start by considering fluctuations in the beta band, which reflects this motor selection. And remember, a negative change here would tell us that motor selection, that you're getting motor selection for the future response hand. And for trials where there was a late interfering event, we see evidence for reselection here just before the probe. But only when we look at trials in which the interference occurred early or at mid time points do we see that the reselection of motor information occurs immediately following the interference. And on this basis, we can clearly eliminate the scenarios in which activation occurs just in time. But we're still not sure whether this is only for motor or if it's for visual and motor. So for this, we have to turn to the visual results. So now we will plot alpha activity in the visual electrodes, again with negative values indicating selection of visual information in the memory item. And what we can see is that the visual selection also is temporally locked to the interference, with the change in alpha power going significantly down after these interfering events. So, following an interfering event in memory maintenance, we see that participants reactivate both sensory and motor information immediately after the interfering event occurs. And yeah, so basically this tells us that in order to recover our memories, we recover all aspects in a very holistic way, both the visual and the motor active information. And we do this immediately. Um, for this last project, we're going to turn to a retrieval process. And this is a project that's being led by Amy Lee, who's coming into the final year of her PhD, and then Ella Quinton, who's a MSc student in the lab. And our data is relatively new, actually. So Ella has just kind of finished data collection this last term. So it's yeah, hot off the press. All right, and here we're shifting gears a bit, and we're looking at decision processes in retrieval. So specifically at both the consequences and the predictors of free choice recall. So the idea is quite simple. In most working memory tasks, people commit information into memory, some time passes, and then they are explicitly told what to recall. So this orange cue tells me, report back the tilt of the orange bar. Yet, if we consider flexible natural behavior, it's not just important to maintain information in working memory, but often we have to actually choose which information we want to act upon. And this fits in this big family of experiments within cognition, which is called willed cognition, where this includes the idea that you get to choose the actions you might use or choose where you pay attention. And these willed action and willed attention literatures have kind of structured how we think about cognitive experiments. And in these cases, researchers have found neural markers that precede these self-initiated responses. Yet within working memory, we don't understand actually what guides retrieval from working memory or what the consequences of the decision process itself might be on the working memory content. So that's the focus of this, is trying to understand this concept of free choice in memory retrieval. And by now, this design is probably looking quite boring and repetitive, but again, we're going to just use this very similar experiment. So here is the specifics for this experiment. We start with encoding of these two tilted bars, and then we follow this up with a delay period. And then we move to the probe stage, and here is really the only kind of trick in this experiment. In half of the trials, participants are told what to report, just like any other standard working memory task. So they get an orange cue that tells them they should report the tilt of the orange item. But in the other half of trials, participants can choose which item they wish to recall. So here, the cue is pink, and neither of the two items they previously saw were pink. So that means you get to choose which one you want to report, either the pink or the blue one. And importantly, these forced and free choice trials are intermixed. So participants can't actually anticipate the choice condition on any given trial. Following the probe, participants report the remembered tilt, and they make a color report. And in this color report, participants indicate the color of the item that they intended to report. So this was important to include because in the free choice trials, we want to know which one were you actually trying to report. Finally, they get a bit of feedback. And then just like in the previous studies, by linking the orientation and the report hand, we can track motor selection through this beta lateralization. And we can track visual selection through posterior alpha lateralization. All right, let's start by looking at some behavior. So perhaps, maybe unsurprisingly, the free choice condition, participants are slower to respond. So here you can see overall, they just took longer to report items in the free choice trials. But what we were surprised about, and what we've now kind of replicated a couple of times, is that there's no difference in participants' errors. So even though participants could choose which item they reported in the free choice trial, they were no better at reporting this item. And this is counterintuitive. We found this surprising because if you get to choose which item you're going to report, it seems like you should just report the one that you know better, and then you would be overall better at that. Uh, Here we're plotting, or I've got on the y-axis error, and this is as a function of degrees. So this is how far away my report was from the actual memory item. But not all errors are the same. And we can break this down, and to show you, demonstrate that, I'm going to show you a little demo here. And we can break this down by different types of errors. So let's say you've got these two items in mind, and you want to report one of them. If you completely forgot both items, then you're going to just randomly guess. And you might report just some random orientation, irrespective of what you previously saw. But if instead of kind of completely forgetting, you might commit a what's called a swap error. And in this case, you misattribute the color of one item to be to the other item. So here, your error is not going to be random, but instead you're going to systematically report the error of the tilt of the wrong item. So I think I'm reporting the orange item, but actually I'm reporting the tilt of the blue item. And we can look at these types of errors, so either guesses or swaps, which are plotted here, as a function of free choice and forced choice trials. And what we see is that observers make more swaps with the non-target item in the free choice trials compared to the forced choice trials. And this suggests that during the decision process, the report is more susceptible to influence from the other item. So that might explain why there is actually no difference in those errors. Okay, so now we're going to look at our EEG signals. And as a reminder, we can look at both visual and motor selection separately for the forced and the free choice trials. And here we're going to plot the change in the contralateral versus the ipsilateral electrodes. And negative or these blue blobs are going to indicate either visual or motor selection. Okay, so our forced choice condition is mostly a replication of the past work and looks pretty standard. We see selection for both the visual side as well as the response hand following the probe. But when we turn to the free choice, we see a slightly different pattern. So although the visual selection seems to be relatively in line with the forced choice, we see motor selection in the free choice starts early. And just to make this point very clear, we can look at the time courses of the signals, and we see no difference between the free and the forced choice for the visual selection, yet we see this significantly earlier motor selection in free choice compared to the forced choice trials. So we thought this was really interesting. So people are selecting the response hand in free choice trials before they are in the forced choice trials. But you might wonder whether this response selection is actually driving the choices that they're making. Yeah, that's just what I just said. So to answer this, we're going to shift our analysis and focus on the, instead of looking at this probe period, that's just what we've been looking at, we're going to now look at the encoding locked period, or the maintenance period. And we're only going to focus on the free choice trials here, and we're going to lock the eventual choice that they make. So this is before they even know that they're in a free choice trial. We're going to look relative to the choice that they make in the future. And so we'll look at visual and motor selection. And although we don't see any evidence for visual selection predicting the eventual choice, we can see that this period during maintenance phase where we get a significant selection for the response hand that is eventually chosen. So this is before people know what kind of trial they're in. We see evidence that the response hand they select during maintenance predicts what choice they will eventually make. And that we took as evidence that responses or actions actually drive some of the decisions that we're making. All right, so that's the last project I'm going to show you for today. And I showed you that free choice recall in working memory leads to both behavioral biases and seems to be action-led. And together, I hope I've convinced you of the importance of considering both visual and motor selection through these different stages, and shown you that indeed working memory is action-oriented. Okay, thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sage. We're just gonna allow a few minutes for people to pop in questions in the Q&A section. So if you click on like more with the three dots, there's a Q&A box. And then if you can just pop their questions in there, that'd be amazing.
Okay, let's see if I can manage